You are now listening to Mark's Unexplained World by Mark the Medium, available on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Prime, Podbean, and most other podcast platforms. Tonight's episode is about Cowboy Bob, the mysterious bank robber. So it's over to you now, Mark, for this week's thrilling episode.
Peggy Jo Tallis, alias Cowboy Bob, was an American bank robber who would cross-dress as a man to conceal her identity. She earned her media epithet of Cowboy Bob due to her always sporting a white 10-gallon hat during her bank robberies, in which she robbed a total of 5 banks in Texas between 1991 and 1992. Peggy Jo Tallis was eventually caught by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI for short. However, as she never used a single weapon during her bank robberies, she only received a light sentence of just 33 months in total. After her release, she then went back home to her mother and continued to care for her daily until she passed away in the December of 2002. And in 2005, after living quietly for the past decade, Peggy Jo Tallis committed suicide by cop after the police caught up to her escaping the scene of her last ever bank robbery. FBI agent Steve Powell admitted during her first arrest in 1992 that he never considered the possibility that Cowboy Bob could be a woman. Greetings, Unexplainers. Thank you for tuning in once again and listening to this Texas bank robbing episode of Mark's Unexplained World. My name is Mark Hughes, psychic medium, ufologist, and a true crime buff. And just to give you a better idea of who I am and what I do, every Monday night I do a podcast on the various subjects under the Unexplained banner. These include ufology, hauntings, disasters, and all sorts of paranormal phenomena, including true crime, unsolved crime, and missing people. So if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review and a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And if you are listening on any other of the podcast platforms, again, give us a like and a follow. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about the bittersweet story surrounding Cowboy Bob, the mysterious bank robber. And this week's necessary disclaimer. Well, this story is a tale that sadly involves details of suicide by cops, so may prove upsetting to some. Needless to say, you listen at your own discretion. Also, all opinions and comments are strictly my own, but the facts of the case still remain. I also apologise again if I pronounce anything incorrectly. My English is my first and only language, so much so that if I had to rob a bank in a foreign language, I'd never get past the first syllable. So, back to the story. Peggy Jo Tallis, alias Cowboy Bob, was born to her parents Pete Tallis Sr. and Helen Faye Tallis in Kaufman, Texas, in the United States on the 6th of June back in 1944. And the town of Kaufman was originally founded as King's Fort, being named after Dr. William P. King, who established the fort in 1840 after purchasing 2.5 square miles of land where the city is now located. The community of King's Fort was renamed Kingsborough after 5 years of growth, and in 1852 Kingsborough was renamed Kaufman after the newly formed Kaufman County, which in turn was named after the attorney, politician and diplomat David S. Kaufman. and as of the 2020 census, its population was just 6,797. Kaufman, Texas does have many notorieties, but the most popular one is that it was the first place that Bonnie Parker, of Bonnie of Clyde fame of course, was incarcerated. Of course, I cannot do a podcast on true crime without touching on a short bio about Bonnie and Clyde, so here goes. Bonnie and Clyde were famous American bandits and multiple murderers who travelled the central United States with their gang during the Great Depression. The couple were known for their bank robberies and multiple murders, although they actually preferred to rob small stores or rural funeral homes. Their exploits captured the attention of the American press and its readership during what is occasionally referred to as the Public Enemy era, between 1931 and 1934. Eventually, they were ambushed by police and shot to death in Bainville Parish, Louisiana. They are believed to have murdered at least 9 police officers and 4 civilians. Peggy Jo Tallis faced tragedy at a very young age, what with her father, Pete Tallis Sr., dying of cancer when she was just 4 years old. This tragedy resulted with her mother, Helen Tallis, being forced to get a job as a nurse aide in order that she could support the family. Peggy Jo Tallis was the youngest of 3 children, and unlike her siblings, she was a free-spirited teenager and dropped out of high school in the 10th grade, being constantly on the go and always looking for a new adventure, with her favourite movie at the time being Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. A childhood friend of Peggy Jo Tallis, a girl named Karen Jones, recalls that one day Peggy Jo hopped into her car and decided to drive to San Francisco. The reason? Because she simply wanted to see what life was like there. Just to give you an idea of how spontaneous Peggy Jo Tallis could be, Kaufman TX to San Francisco by car would take you approximately 25 hours and 12 minutes to drive. When Peggy Jo Tallis hit her 20s, she moved to North Dallas and got herself a job as a receptionist at a Marriott hotel. And while she was working at the Marriott, she became close friends with another receptionist named Cherry Young. One of the things that Cherry Young noted about Peggy Jo Tallis was that she had no desire to get married or have any children, nor did she think about a career or money. One afternoon, while the two were driving, they passed a Wells Fargo armoured truck, at which point Peggy Jo Tallis then turned to Cherry Young saying, and I quote,
"You know, I could rob that and not have to worry about anything for a while."
Cherry Young, in response to her comment, just laughed it off, not thinking even for a moment that Peggy Jo would ever do such a thing. As the years went by, Peggy Jo Tallis's friends, one by one, all ended up getting married and having families of their own. However, not Peggy Jo Tallis, as a bad experience with one man was all that she needed to make her steer clear of all men for good. And to be honest, I do not so blame her, really horrible hairy things that we are. Well, I am anyway. Peggy Jo Tallis then decided to take a different path in life. For starters, in 1977, she was booked by the police for car theft in Tarrant County. And then, in 1984, she moved in with her mother, Helen Tallis, to a Dallas suburb to help care for her, as she had fallen ill with a degenerative bone disease. Unfortunately, though, as with most things, the medical bills kept rising, and Peggy Jo Tallis felt like she was falling behind financially and could not catch up. And, like most people, she was too proud to ask for any help. Her friend Cherry Young, who, if you remember, was her fellow receptionist at the Marriott Hotel, explained to Peggy Jo Tallis that it was likely that she felt as if her, and I quote,
life was slipping away,
and that she was, again I quote,
losing her wild side.
After this first short break, in part 2, we will look at a typical bank raid scenario as conducted by Cowboy Bob, and the moment the penny dropped when the police realised his true identity.
This show is brought to you courtesy of Neil Packer and the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre. Find them online at www.hauntedresearchcentre.com or at 9 to 11 Regent Street, Hinckley, LE10 1AW. Open on Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. for guided tours of the haunted rooms at just £3 per person. Booking is essential at all times, and over 16s only, please, unless accompanied by an adult. The haunted rooms are extremely haunted, and paranormal activity could and has taken place at any time. Some areas and particular objects or items can be quite scary and unnerving. Membership is available for £25 to qualify for selective offers. And why not download the app, available on both iOS and Android for only $3.99, to keep up to date with what is coming up at the centre.
Thanks for listening to Mark's Unexplained World. If you are interested in parapsychology, quantum sciences, and true encounters with the other side, you may wish to visit The Weird Walk Home. That's my show on YouTube. Also, stay tuned, because After Dark with Tilly and Mark is creeping your way in June. Additionally, if you are interested in weird sciences, you may like to purchase my brand new book on Amazon. That would be Weird Time by Tim R. Swartz. It features lots of strange explanations and encounters with time from myself and other notable names like Lon Strickler and more. Thanks for listening.
For over a year, between 1991 and 1992, Cowboy Bob, the mysterious bank robber, whilst wearing his 10-gallon hat, was roaming the streets, pulling off large-scale bank robberies with a near-flawless achievement. According to tellers' testimonies, a typical bank robbery from Cowboy Bob would go something like this. Cowboy Bob, whilst wearing his 10-gallon hat, was always calm, always unarmed, always polite, and most importantly, always silent. He was always very thorough in his heists, steering clear of any security cameras, and he checked each bill for any marks or die packs. On a short interesting side note here, a die pack, or an Intelligent Banknote Neutralization System, or IBNS for short, is a security system that banks, ATMs, retail establishments, vending machines, and the cash-in-transit industry utilises to render stolen funds unusable and easily identifiable. Die packs are inserted between bills in random bundles. If a bundle contains a die pack, if a bundle containing a dye pack is removed from a specific area, i.e. taken out of the bank doors, it explodes, releasing an indelible ink dye and a possible array of additional chemicals. The conspicuous bright colour, usually red, stains the bills, allowing the quick, easy visual recognition of stolen money. Tracers and markers can also be added to the ink or bonding agent, providing forensic evidence linking the criminal to the crime. When Cowboy Bob was finished, he would usually casually exit the bank, place a new or stolen license plate onto the back of his 1975 Pontiac Grand Prix, and then simply just drive off. And due to his large 10-gallon hat and his fake beard, the tellers of the bank never saw his actual face. The closest description that the police and later the FBI were able to come up with was that he was around 5'10", a slight beer belly with greying hair, and of course the beard. And due to the stolen license plates, the police were unable to match the car to anyone matching the bank teller's description, and without any other leads, all the police could do was continue to trace the license plate numbers in the hope that one of them would eventually turn up with a real name. And then, one day, one finally did. It may have been through Cowboy Bob's overconfidence, or it may have been through his sheer cockiness, but upon leaving one of his last robberies, he plain forgot to replace his real license plate with one of his fakes. So, in this instance, the real number plate was written down by one of the bank's customers, who then reported it to the police. The license plate number, once it was checked out, brought the police's attention to a Dallas car dealer named Pete Tallis. And then the police, thinking that they had finally got their man, arrested Pete Tallis, only to find out, after much questioning and interrogation, that he had in fact never actually owned the car in the first place. It was at this very exasperated stage that former agent Steve Powell told the Texas Monthly, and I quote, "He," meaning Cowboy Bob of course, "was making me start to pull my hair out. How could this thin little dried up cowboy be whipping us this bad continuously time after time?" On an interesting side note, the Texas Monthly is a monthly American magazine that has its headquarters in downtown Austin, Texas, which was founded in 1973 by Michael R. Levy. Texas Monthly chronicles life in contemporary Texas, writing on politics, the environment, industry, education, and leisure topics such as music, art, dining, and travel. It is also a member of the City and Regional Magazine Association, or the CRMA for short, and as of 2023, has a monthly distribution of 257,611 copies. All was not lost, however, because what the police did find out was that Pete Tallis had actually brought the car as a gift for his sister, and her name was, you guessed it, Peggy Jo Tallis. Now the police and the FBI agents believed that things were finally starting to come together. So, with the help of her brother Pete Tallis, law enforcement managed to track down Peggy Jo Tallis by paying her a visit to her home, which the police assumed she shared with her boyfriend. They also figured that Peggy Jo Tallis must be the young, wild girlfriend of Cowboy Bob, much like a sort of modern-day version of the aforementioned Bonnie and Clyde. And although Cowboy Bob always robbed banks on his own, his girlfriend, who in this instance they figured must be Peggy Jo Tallis, had to be in on it somehow, either by procuring stolen licence plates or even hiding the stolen money. But it was not until they visited Peggy Jo Tallis that the police actually realised just how wrong they were. What law enforcement was expecting and what they found could not have been any further apart. They expected to find a wild young woman, complete with half-smoked cigarettes, half-empty bottles of booze and a hangover after a banging party. But instead, they got a middle-aged, motherly figure living in a modest two-bedroom home with an ailing mother. And although they knew there had to have been some sort of mistake, they figured, what the hell, we'll ask questions anyway. Law enforcement asked the middle-aged motherly figure if she had a boyfriend or if she had a husband, and they even asked her if she had heard about the recent string of bank robberies that had taken place. The middle-aged motherly figure's answer to all the questions was no, of course she hadn't, and that she was simply a middle-aged woman who spent all of her free time caring for her ailing mother. The story of Peggy Jo Tallis being a simple middle-aged woman caring for her ailing mother was backed up by other family members, all of whom insisted that Peggy Jo not only didn't have a boyfriend, but also that she had no time for a boyfriend, and that she most certainly was not one who would be mixed up in something so criminal as robbing banks. Even when law enforcement searched the home and found men's clothing and a fake beard in the closet, Peggy Jo still insisted that she did not have a boyfriend. She even told the former agent Steve Powell, and I quote,
"There isn't any man, I promise you that."
It was at this point Steve Powell noticed something he hadn't noticed before. On closer inspection of Peggy Jo Tallis's upper lip, he noticed a thin line of glue. But not only that, in her hair were flecks of grey dye. Suddenly, the light bulb came on and the realisation came into play. Peggy Jo Tallis had been telling the truth all along, and that was that her boyfriend was not Cowboy Bob. She was. After this second short break, in part 3, we will look at Peggy Jo Tallis's trial, the media's reaction, Cowboy Bob's last hurrah, and her suicide by cop.
Fright Nights was established in 1999 as the first company in the world to offer overnight ghost hunt experiences to the general public, pioneering paranormal events since the last century. Fright Nights operate at hundreds of the UK's most haunted and exclusive venues. All events have their own team of experienced paranormal investigators, mediums and psychics. They have a VIP members club for regular returning guests, offering loyalty discounts and exclusive invitation-only events. They can also host private events for your family and friends. You can contact them on 07852 998 628 or email them at office@frightnights.co.uk, or take a look at their website at www.frightnights.co.uk, where you can see the many locations they investigate and learn about them and the opportunities they have available. Hundreds of ghost hunters join Fright Nights every month for the most thrilling ghost hunting experiences they'll never forget. If you haven't been on a ghost hunt before, then why not join them to see what it's all about? Why not visit their social media sites, for up-to-date information on all the places they visit and to see what's coming up in the future. They look forward to seeing you all soon. Fright Nights, ghost hunting events. Remember, only the original will do.
The newspapers and media, quite naturally, had an absolute field day, which, to be perfectly honest with you, I'm not really surprised. It is not every day that you get a story about a cross-dressing bank robber. I mean, this was a real headline stuff. The press and TV reporters went all out and hunted down Peggy Jo Tallis's relatives. However, they all refused to comment on the story, mainly because they were so stunned about what Peggy Jo had been up to. One of her sisters, Michelle Tallis, said, and I quote,
"We had absolutely no idea. We asked Helen if she knew what Aunt Peggy had been doing, and all she kept saying was, 'Robbing banks? Peggy was robbing banks?'"
The local police began to The local police began to put Peggy Jo's story together when they interviewed her family, her friends, and even some of her neighbours. They initially found out that her situation all started when her mother got sick, and that had been her breaking point. You see, before her mother's illness, Peggy Jo Tallis had been a carefree, spirited young woman who was looking to make a splash in the world. But unfortunately, when she became her mother's sole caregiver, her ambitions started to slowly disappear, which meant that she had lost that sparkle. And as time went on, and due to her mother's illness, her mother began to become more and more dependent on her. And so, as a consequence, she started to buckle under the pressure of the medical bills and was constantly looking for a way to balance her current situation with the life that she had always dreamed of. So the bottom line was that she had turned to robbing banks, thinking that it was the easiest way to make a few extra dollars. However, maybe because her life had become samey and humdrum, she ended up enjoying the thrill of the rob, so much so that she carried on robbing even more banks, even after she had enough cash to catch up and pay her bills. And so consequently, like most people who suffer with greed and excitement, this was probably her downfall. In total, Peggy Jo Tallis robbed 5 banks in Texas between the years of 1991 and 1992, and ended up being tried and convicted of her crimes as Cowboy Bob, but as she never used a weapon during any of her robberies, she only received a light sentence of just 33 months behind bars. By the mid-1990s, and now almost in her 60s, Peggy Jo was released from prison and back living with her mother. Her and her mother then moved from the Dallas suburb to a 2-bedroom townhouse in Garland. While living in Garland, Peggy Jo managed to find employment as a cashier at the Harbor Bay Marina at Lake Ray Hubbard, which is located just outside of Dallas, selling customers everything from coolers to keychains that float on the water. And according to Susie Leslie, who was by then the manager at the Harbor Bay Marina, she said of Peggy Jo, and I quote,
"She was one of our best employees. Not once did the money in the cash register come up short on her list shift."
By this time, though, her mother was becoming very sick, so Peggy Jo would end up spending most of her spare time at home with her. Every night she gave her mother a bath and put her to bed. Then she would sit alone in her bedroom, usually watching nature documentaries on the television until late at night. It was while living in Garland that Peggy Jo's life suddenly took a dark turn when first off she was told that her older sister, Nancy, had died of breast cancer, and then shortly afterwards, in the December of 2002, she found that her 83-year-old mother had passed away overnight in her sleep. According to Susie Leslie, who had by then become close friends with Peggy Jo, she said, and I quote,
"She could have put her mother in a nursing home a long time ago, but she was relieved her mother was no longer in pain, yet you could tell she was still heartbroken."
One year passed, and then another, and over time Peggy Jo Tallis lost touch with her old friends like Cherry Young and Karen Jones. And in 2004, Peggy Jo Tallis was starting to get restless again when the calling from her carefree spirit had returned. So, for old time's sake, she figured she would pull off one last heist and use the money to move to the beaches of Mexico, where she had always dreamed of living. However, like most of us in our 60s, her old age and her wits had begun to let her down. Rather than go through an elaborate plan and bring Cowboy Bob out of retirement by wearing a disguise as she had done in the past, on this particular heist, she was simply just herself, wearing sunglasses and a wide-brimmed sun hat. She also got very careless with her once thoroughness being lost on her, and rather than checking for any dye packs, she simply grabbed the bills without noticing them, and so as a result, as she left the building, the hall exploded. Realising that her plans lay ruined in red dye, she then did what all bank robbers would do in this situation. She just fled the scene. Peggy Jo Tallis then ran, very quickly I hasten to add, to an RV that she had parked ready for her getaway vehicle in the parking lot. The police was soon alerted, and after they gave Peggy Jo a short chase, they finally managed to corner her in a residential neighbourhood. As law enforcement surrounding the RV, Peggy Jo Tallis slowly came out of the vehicle armed with a gun, for the very first time in her life. I think it's only fair to point out here that the police were hesitant to shoot due to the fact that Peggy Jo Tallis had never resorted to any violence in the past. However, the other main thing that the police were unaware of at the time was that the gun Peggy Jo was using was in fact only a toy gun. Peggy Jo was having none of their hesitance and dared them to shoot her, goading the police by shouting, and I quote,
"You mean to tell me if I come out of here with a gun and point it at you, you're not going to shoot me?"
When the police refused to shoot her, she pulled out her toy pistol, which then led to 4 police officers firing at her at the same time, and she was immediately shot dead. Upon further inspection of the area, meaning the body and the RV, the police officers realised that the gun in Peggy Jo's hands had been a toy pistol all along, which she carried with her in a bid to instill fear towards her victims. However, upon closer inspection of the RV, police did find a very real and very loaded .357 Smith & Wesson Magnum. Although Peggy Jo's capture was undoubtedly a win for the police and the FBI, her death was not without its sadness. After all, her bank robbing sprees did keep the FBI and law enforcement constantly on their guard for years, giving the former FBI agent Steve Powell some of the best on-the-job work experience he could ever hope for. And from what I can gather upon FBI agent Steve Powell hearing about Peggy Jo's death, he expressed remorse, saying, and I quote, say it ain't so. There were about 30 members of the Tallis family and a few of Peggy Jo's friends gathered for a private burial service. In an impromptu eulogy, her sister, Michelle Tallis, told a story about Peggy Jo adopting a wounded duck at the marina where she worked at the time and naming it Bernice. And one of her brothers then read some scripture and said afterwards, and I quote, "I am certain that in the few minutes leading up to her death, as she sat in the RV contemplating her fate, Peg was making peace with God." Peggy Jo Tallis, alias Cowboy Bob, is now buried in her hometown at the Kaufman City Cemetery.
Thank you all for taking the time out to listen to this episode of Mark's Unexplained World. In our next episode, show number 110, we are going to be looking at the missing children of the Runaway Train song. Runaway Train is a song by American alternative rock band Soul Asylum, released in the June of 1993. There were 3 original versions of the video released in the United States, totaling 36 missing children shown throughout. 26 missing children were found after being featured in the video for the Runaway Train song, but as of 2022, the whereabouts of 10 of the 36 children who appeared in the videos still remains unknown, and so they are still classed as missing.
This show was written and researched by myself, Mark Hughes, and proofread and edited by Linda Hughes. The pronunciations of all the names and places, though, was all mine. I don't think I had any bad ones this week. The actors in this episode were Mark Hughes, Linda Hughes, Denise Poolar and Tilly Treadwell from the Weird Walk Home podcast. With special thanks to Neil Packer and the staff at the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre in Hinckley. And a big thank you to every one of you for listening. We never run out of ideas here at the office for Mark's Unexplained World podcast. But if you know of any other intriguing stories under the Unexplained banner, which includes ufology, hauntings, disasters and any other sort of paranormal phenomena, as well as true crime, unsolved crime and missing people, just drop me a message, a direct message, and I'll see what I can do. I will also include the name of the person who suggested the idea at the end credits of the podcast. And again, just to add, if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a thumbs up and a review, and subscribe to my channel. And if you're listening on any other podcast platforms out there, again, give us a like and a follow. I thank you in advance. Mark's Unexplained World, because there's more to the paranormal than meets the third eye. And remember guys, keep it real, because being real is better than being perfect. This show and all its contents are covered by basic copyright of Mark the Medium.